Welcome to a conversation with Sanford Biggers and Miki Garcia. Miki Garcia is Executive Director of the Contemporary Arts Forum in Santa Barbara, and Sanford Biggers is our artist who is going to be showing his work coming up March 6, 2010.
So, I thought maybe we would start not at the beginning, but maybe at I think a good place to start is maybe when you and I met, which was probably 2002.
Yeah, around then.
And I'll just give a little bit of background. I was working in New York then at the Public Art Fund, and you had submitted a proposal that we were really interested in trying to get off the ground. And I think that you ended up actually doing a portion of that with the breakdancers, or was that before?
The breakdancers was before, but I think part of this proposal ended up being my work at the Socrates
Right.
residency.
Right. Well, I just want to say that this exhibition, personally for me, is kind of a long. I have no words. I'm not articulate right now, but it's kind of the end of, or a moment in a long journey that started when I was really interested in. Over the years, you've kept in touch in your galleries. We keep in touch, and it's just really exciting to have you finally doing a project.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'd love to start right around then, because I think that is really when your work started to take sort of an era of engagement or experience with an audience that I hope that one will be able to have, and an audience member here in Santa Barbara will be able to experience that with your performance as well as with some of the other pieces. Talk to me a little bit about. Did you hear me? Can you talk to me? Talk to me a little bit about the work that you were doing in early 2000, and maybe we can talk a little bit about how that is still in play now.
Sure. So in 2000, the early 2000s, the aughts, I was really interested in making interactive pieces, largely using motif of Buddhist mandalas. I had recently returned from living in Japan for a few years.
You lived in Nagoya.
I lived in Nagoya the first time, and I lived there for around 2.5 years. And then the second time I lived in Ibaraki-ken, right outside of Tokyo. And while I was living in Japan, I traveled all throughout Asia and really became interested in Buddhism and some of the iconography of the religion. And when I returned to the U.S., I started making work that I considered to be autobiographical, because it fused some of what I had been studying and researching in terms of Buddhism, but also bringing in some things from my childhood, growing up in Los Angeles and being an old school b-boy. And one of the pieces that I did when I first moved to New York was what I call the mandala of the Bee Bodhisattva, which was a mandala-like dance floor that was around 16 feet square. And I took it to the Bronx and used it for a breakdance competition called the Battle of the Boroughs. And that was between members of the Rocksteady crew and the New York City Breakers and a lot of members of the community, younger breakdancers. And I remember when I was a child breakdancing, the kind of seriousness and discipline that we used to use when we practiced. We would all meet at the same place, the same time every week. We would walk in and put on our uniforms like we were going to the dojo. And for, boys growing up in the inner city, this really was
A ritual.
It was a ritual of ours. So I could understand that with these carrying on that tradition 20 years afterwards. And this was an opportunity to not only provide a dance floor, a backdrop for them, but also to fuse it with this notion of Buddhism and the same type of discipline and ritual that monks may even go through.
Right.
And as you recall, the mandalas, of course, are circular-based diagrams, and the breakdancers, of course, were doing circular-based movements. So there was an aesthetic echo between those two things.
I think that's what's really interesting, is that your work bridges, it's autobiographical, but in a sense, this work really speaks to a whole generation of people who, artists as well as others, who are really coming to a realization that cultures are have much more in common than they have different in many ways. And while for you, bringing your sort of childhood background and your experience in Japan and fusing it with something that came sort of organically for you, it also is part of your experience, wouldn't you say, in living in Europe and living in Japan, of the way that those cultures appropriated American cultures and kind of this going back and forth, this kind of circuitous globalization that your work, I think, is really reflective of, and I think why it holds a lot of potency is because it, a lot of people's experiences are much more complex than the kind of black and white understanding that we kind of might have grown up with 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Do you have any anecdotes? I know that maybe the video piece with your girlfriend at the time, that is something that maybe seems a little bit foreign, but actually these kinds of these cultures sort of interacting has really always been there and has happened.
You're referring to the haircutting ceremony,
yeah.
right? Which was another project that I did in Japan, where I cut off my 8 years of dreadlocks.
And I met you when you had dreadlocks.
And you met me, exactly. So I made basically a unique ritual where I had, it was an ex-girlfriend at the time, but someone who I was very close to in Japan, cut my hair in a ceremony type situation in a forest in Japan. And I was wearing full kimono, she was wearing full kimono, and it was shot in a very cinematic style with a lot of attention paid to the details of the kimono and the changing of the seasons. I like to actually consider that piece to be a Japanese pastoral more than an identity or autobiographical piece on some level. But ultimately, she cuts each one of my dreadlocks off and then shaves my head down, and the whole while I'm sitting in meditation. And when she finishes, I open my eyes, and coincidentally the wind starts to blow and the leaves start to blow across my face. And the contrast between her springtime kimono and the fall season in which we shot it in is really
It's really golden.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, following that idea, I think that.
But her family has had an attachment with dreadlocks or a culture.
No, well, she and her brother were Rastas.
Right.
She and her brother were part of a sound system. And for those that don't know, sound systems are a Jamaican tradition, actually. And this is the precursor to hip-hop as well. So it's all very much related. Sound systems in Jamaica were basically neighborhood MCs and DJs who would press vinyl plates of their hot singles. And instead of getting it distributed to the radio, they would put a bunch of speakers on the back of the truck and drive around the neighborhoods with these freshly pressed vinyls and play the songs. And as they drove around, it gained popularity, and then they would sell these vinyls for very cheap. And then later in the week, they'd have a big party where they would battle another truck from another neighborhood. Those were called sound systems, representing different neighborhoods. So that tradition picked up in Japan somewhere in the early 80s, bypassing America altogether. And she and her brother were part of one of these sound systems. So as we became more friendly with each other, and I learned more about her after I started to learn the language, she would talk to me about Marcus Garvey and all this Haile Selassie, all this deep Rasta stuff. It turns out she and her friends were growing a lot of their food and trading clothes and living this very agrarian lifestyle, which was similar to Rastas, but also is very old school traditional Japanese. So they really understood the syncretic relationship between these cultures. And it went as far as Jamaicans going directly to Japan and recording with some of these Japanese sound systems and making plates there. Totally, bypassing the US and the UK. So that was interesting. It was totally fascinating for me to see that. But, I look at this biography and these autobiographies as merely a gateway, because we are just composites of our experiences. So though I do consider the work to be autobiographical on some level, I am the sum of my experiences. So anybody I come into contact with does, in fact, define my identity. So it's, I don't know, I think